Sanje Chedan Suji Chonam La Chanchu Bado Nani Chasuji Dagi Jinzo Jipe Sanam Rola Penche Sanje Rupa Sanje Chedan Suji Chonam La Chanchu Bado Dani Chasuji Dagi Jinzo Jepe Sanamji Rula Pinche Sanje Drupajo Sanje Chedan Soichi Chonamla Chanjo Bado Dani Chasuchi Dagi Jinzo Jepe Sanamji Rula Pinche Sanje Drupajo Venerable Lama Jampa Thaye Chiwo Peme Denshula Katen Jembo Gone Jesonde Kuzondu Jenera Saldo. So I'd like to say good morning to everybody. And to our continuation of the teachings on Jamgon Control Lord Thaye's guide to the Shentong Madhyamaka view. We're now completely caught up to where the teaching finished last year, and that means that in relation to the structure that Jamgon Control made for his teaching, we are now in the section concerning meditation on the view, and in particular the way in which we are introduced to the Buddha nature itself, the definitive view, the view of the third tenet of the Wheel Sutras, and in particular of the view as expressed by Maitreya in the Supreme Continuity, the text called the Supreme Continuity. So we've been doing that for a little bit. So now we reach a section. If you're referring to the English translation, it's page 15, near the bottom of page 15, in fact. And here, at this point, Jamgon Control will show us the Buddha nature, or introduce us to the Buddha nature, relying on 9 examples of how how the Buddha nature exists, even although it is veiled or obscured by temporary impurities, which is of course the state of everybody except Buddhas, because they've fully purified the Buddha nature, the primordial nature of mind, from those temporary impurities consisting of the obscurations, disturbing emotions, and ignorance about the nature of reality. Yet, the point is that even though right now the Buddha nature may not be apparent at all, we may not even have any notion that it is the true nature of our mind, it is here and always has been. And although it is surrounded by impurities, those impurities have never stained it, they've never entered into it. So it's not that, as one might consider, I have the Buddha nature, but it's kind of mixed at the moment, and I need to improve it, I need to remove things from it. No, they've never entered into the Buddha nature, they've never become part of it. So the path, the practice of the path, is not about cleansing the Buddha nature, as one might think. As one would say, if something had dirt within it, one had to remove that dirt. That's not the case. So in the Jude Lama, in the Supreme Continuity, in the Vajra Point 4, as it's called, the fourth of the 7 sections into which the Jude Lama is divided, Maitreya used 9 examples of how we might understand this relationship between the Buddha nature, naturally pure, and the temporary surrounding impurities. So there, Maitreya says, like a Buddha in a decayed, faded lotus, like honey in the midst of bees, like a grain inside a husk, like gold in filth, like a treasure underground, like a seed contained in a fruit, like a statue of the Buddha in tattered rags, like a ruler of men in the womb of a poor woman, and like a precious image inside a clay mold. So now the element, meaning here the Buddha nature, that which is true, the Buddha nature dwells within all sentient beings, temporarily obscured by the impure, disturbing emotions. So as Control Odotai says, recite these 9 similes and reflect on them. If I wanted to understand these similes in more detail, one should know that each of the similes, each of the examples, is describing the Buddha nature or rather the impurities in various strengths, beginning with how they are for us, totally deluded sentient beings, right up to how they are in a high-level bodhisattva. So, for instance, the first one, like a Buddha in a faded lotus, this is an image of how the Buddha nature exists in us, but temporarily obscured by the disturbing emotion of desire. And it's a very beautiful example, I think, because a lotus has beauty, but it's faded in this case. So in us, that totally obscures the Buddha nature right now. The second analogy is that like a honey in the midst of bees. Honey is something sweet, something very pleasant, but we cannot get to it when there's a swarm of bees. Similarly, the Buddha nature exists within us, but is temporarily obscured by the disturbing emotion of hatred. And of course, the bees represent that aggression, which is the characteristic of hatred. The third analogy, a grain inside a husk, again, it's about our state now as totally deluded sentient beings, but this represents, the husk represents the disturbing emotion of the third poison, ignorance. So when one sees a husk, one doesn't see what is within it. One may think the husk is all that there is. Similarly, we, sentient beings, we do not see that within our mind there is actually the primordial purity of the Buddha nature. It's totally obscured to our vision. But if we engage with the path, we remove the husk that surrounds that grain, and the grain then flowers, produces the result. The fourth analogy was a gold in filth. Gold, of course, is the analogy for the Buddha nature. Filth represents here like excrement and so on, like the strong, active, disturbing emotions, which one feels disgusted by because it's so obviously repellent. So when one looks at oneself and sees the strong disturbing emotions, there should be a feeling of revulsion. But nevertheless, within that there is the Buddha nature, totally uncorrupted, totally unstained, and full of all its qualities, as with gold. So as with gold, if one stumbled across it, surrounded no matter by how repulsive, disturbing emotions, one should know the gold is naturally pure and simply remove the filth that temporarily obscures it. Then the fifth analogy was the Buddha nature is like a treasure under the ground. One might think a little more about this, consider it to be like, say, a poor person. He or she lives in terrible conditions. They're hungry. Because they feel they have no wealth. And yet, all the time, unknown to them, under the very floor of their meager home, there is a treasure which would overcome all their poverty. So within us, there is the Buddha nature, but we don't know it because of the influence of our karmic imprints, the imprints produced by karma, which right now do not allow us to, they're so strong, they mistake our real nature, and therefore we do not realize we have all the qualities, the wealth, the treasure, so to speak, as His Holiness talks so often about the inner wealth. This is the inner wealth which we all have. But like that poor man sitting and experiencing or feeling he's poor, we have this treasure at all times, and we've always had it. This is the way the Buddha nature exists within us. Then the sixth analogy is it's like a seed contained within a fruit. This is now the state of the impurities and the relation to the Buddha nature in somebody who has advanced on the path, who is engaged with the practice and has now reached the level of a noble bodhisattva, the first level, the joyful bhumi. In terms of the 5 paths, it's the path of vision. In short, because a seed in a fruit is somewhat more perceptible. We have a notion now, there is the Buddha nature, and it's starting to, as it were, influence us. As we know it's there, we have confidence. Just as on the 3rd path, the path of vision, for the first time, one sees non-conceptually the presence of the Buddha nature. It's not fully manifest yet. Its qualities are not fully manifested in our lives, but we know it's there, just like one knows that a fruit contains a seed and will give rise to further fruit in the future. So that's the Buddha nature at the level of a first bhumi bodhisattva. And then the 7th analogy was the statue of a Buddha in tattered rags. Now, here one imagines a beautiful Buddha statue endowed with all the kind of qualities, perfect shape and color and so on, and one glimpses it, but it's got these dirty rags around it, which one knows in order for it to be really seen as it truly is, and its qualities to truly radiate, those rags need to be removed. And this is analogous to the bodhisattva who is now on the path, the 4th of the 5 paths, the path of cultivation or meditation. They have confidence that the Buddha nature is the nature of their mind, but they have to remove the imprints of the obscurations. No new imprints are being generated, but the imprints from previous lives have to be removed, and they're analogous to the tattered rags. And then the 8th analogy was a ruler of men. It means like a chakra, a wheel-turning emperor. So one must think of it like, this example is like using the idea of the most powerful person in the world. But who is his mother to be? Because he's an unborn child at the moment, he's just been conceived. He's actually been conceived in the womb of a very poor, a very humble woman, who nobody would think could possibly be the mother of the future emperor of the world. So similarly, at the level of the seventh bhumi, the far-going bhumi, one is just about to reach the totally pure, the pure levels of a bodhisattva, and so much of the imprints, karmic imprints, have been removed, the imprints of the obscurations, but there's still a little more to do. Similarly, it is not long now before the emperor is born from the womb of his mother and assumes his natural position. And then finally, the final image was of, again, a precious Buddha image, this time in a clay mold. So the clay mold has the very shape of the Buddha within it. So from the eighth level, the very pure bhumi called the unshakable bhumi, up through to the 10th, the cloud of Dharma, the shape of the future Buddha is present. That's why it's said that for ordinary sentient beings, when we see a bodhisattva on the 8th, 9th, and 10th levels, we cannot ourselves distinguish between such a one and a fully enlightened Buddha. But there is still a distinction. There's still some final traces of the imprints to be removed. But the way the Buddha will manifest is becoming apparent. That's again why I said that on the 8th, 9th, and 10th bhumis, the bodhisattva purifies the Buddha field in which he or she will manifest. So these are in each of these analogies we have something that represents the Buddha nature, and then something that represents the surrounding obscurations. But in all cases, the surrounding obscurations have never become part of it. So what does the path do? Well, the path does nothing to the Buddha nature. The path doesn't improve it, doesn't add anything to it. It doesn't need that. If it had to be created by such effort or improved by such effort, it would be a dependent phenomenon. It would be conditioned, it would be impermanent. No, the practice of the path is to remove the obscurations, which can be removed precisely because they never became part of our mind, never became part of the Buddha nature. So that is the point of this wonderful series of images of the Buddha nature in the obscurations. So then, Contra Lodra Thaye wants to emphasize that point about how the faults that surround our Buddha nature, and which seem to prevent us realizing it, can be separated, can be removed. Yet at the same time, the Buddha nature itself has always possessed the qualities of a Buddha. So as Contra Lodra Thaye says, all kind of phenomena, such as actions, causes and effects, so karma in short, the ripening of karma, the disturbing emotions, the 5 aggregates, the body, feeling, perceptions, formations, and consciousness, in other words, the elements, the 18 elements, the element of visual consciousness, the element of visual object, and the element of the visual faculty, and so on. The sense bases, the inner sense of the visual of the eye, the visual sense base, and the form sense base, and so on. The 12 sense bases, in other words, dependent origination, and so on. The totality of conditioned phenomena, however you categorize them, however you box them, which we cling to now as real, as true, and as something where we can find ourselves, define ourselves, and define external objects, all those, Contra Lodra Thaye says, ultimately cannot be known. Ultimately cannot be known means you cannot find them. It's not that the world is a mystery. It doesn't mean it cannot be known because everything is mysterious, and impossible to understand. He means when you really look for these phenomena, which you have assumed up to now are truly existent, you don't find them. That, of course, goes back to what we studied earlier about the need to negate clinging to phenomena as real. So we can now have confidence that everything we've mistakenly identified as ourselves and our world actually is empty of any intrinsic nature. As he says, they remain unblemished in conventional existence. Meaning, conventionally one might refer to these things like karma, cause and effect, this is the cause, and that's the result, virtue is the cause, suffering is the result. And from the perspective of conventional truth, that's valid. But but conventional truth is, as we've defined it previously, how things appear to be when you don't examine them analytically. So it's valid when you take appearances as they seem to be, to say virtue produces happiness, non-virtue produces suffering. But if you were to really look, you could not find any true cause there, which exists in itself, or any true effect there that exists in itself. So we've been clinging to all those apparent phenomena, conventional truth phenomena, in other words, as real, as our ultimate nature, as ultimately true. But it's never been true. So we can easily, so to speak, discard it, just like awakening from a dream and realizing everything we felt was real in the dream and to which we reacted with emotions was never there in the first place. You don't have to, once you realize it's a dream, you don't have to work through each individual bit and scrape it off your mind, so to speak. It's always was ultimately non-existent. So it is with conventional phenomena. So all those nine images of what obscures the Buddha nature were all just like that. All just temporary manifestations without any core reality, without any solidity. So we can separate them, we can dissolve them. And this is the purpose of the meditation on emptiness as a negation, to separate out, to strip away the impure that surrounds the Buddha nature. But at that point, there is no further need for negation, because if we continue to practice negation, we'll try to even negate the Buddha nature itself, which would make enlightenment impossible. So, therefore, the Buddha nature is freed from the obscurations, but then the Buddha nature and its qualities are fully manifest. Just as all the images in the nine, the images of the Buddha nature, they show the Buddha nature as something totally pure and totally complete from the very beginning, whether it's the Buddha in a faded lotus, where it's the Buddha in the mold. The image representing Buddha nature is one that represents its totality, its completeness. So, Jamgon Kongtrul Lodro Thai says, with regard to the Buddha nature and its qualities, the self-arising marks and signs, so the Buddha is said to possess 32 major marks of perfection and 80 minor marks of perfection. They're described in chapter 6 of the Judlama, which describes these Buddha qualities. Furthermore, the 10 powers of the Buddha, such as his knowledge of what is correct and what is incorrect, his knowledge of past lives, of others, of himself, and having removed all the biases, the outflows as we call them. Again, these 10 powers are listed in the Judlama. They're also listed in the Jewel Ornament and, of course, in the Kenjuk. The 4 fearlessnesses, the way in which Buddha is like a lion in proclaiming the Dharma in 4 respects in front of any audience due to his total knowledge of the Four Noble Truths. So in other words, Controller Thaye is going to kind of give us a summary of the qualities of a Buddha here. He's going to list the most significant ones. Actually, of course, in one way it's an impossible task, because Buddha nature, Buddhahood, being unconditioned, you cannot limit, exhaust its qualities as if it were a fixed and defined thing with only a certain kind of number of qualities, which could easily be then defined and listed. So when we talk about the qualities of the Buddha, as here, one should realize these are just like hints at what the nature of a Buddha is. But here in the Shentong teaching, we're not only saying these are the qualities that manifest at Buddhahood, but are already present in our mind from beginningless time. So we've had the 32 marks, and 80 minor marks, the 10 powers, which are like a Vajra, the 4 fearlessnesses like a lion, the 3 foundations of mindfulness. I should say a bit about that because you're probably more familiar with the 4 foundations of mindfulness. But these are 3 foundations of mindfulness possessed by a Buddha in respect to his way of experiencing the disciples and their apprehension of the teaching that he gives. So the Buddha is unmoved by whether the disciples really understand the teaching or do not understanding or only partially understand it. So he's not emotionally reactive to that because he has nothing to gain, nothing to acquire, and nothing to fear. So he's undisturbed in these 3 ways in terms of the disciples' reception. So that is the meaning of the 3 foundations of mindfulness here. Then, continuing the qualities, great love and compassion. We as beginners meditate, of course, on love, the wished beings of happiness and the cause of happiness. We meditate on compassion, the beings be free from suffering and the cause of suffering. Buddha has brought these to fulfillment. His love is utterly limitless towards all sentient beings for all time, in all situations, similar with his compassion. But even though on the path we practice these methods, in fact, the capacity for love and compassion is fully present within our minds and always has been. Then the next qualities mentioned are the concentrations, the meditative concentrations, such as the Vajra-like concentration, as it's called. In these sutras, particularly Perfection of Wisdom sutras, he mentions different concentrations, different focal points that a Buddha concentrates upon in order to produce certain results for his followers. But also there's certain concentrations we develop along the path, such as the heroic concentration is called, the illusion-like concentration, and the Vajra-like concentration, with which we remove the final traces of the imprints when we've reached the 10th noble level of a bodhisattva. All those concentrations that we could assume we have to develop along the path and will be only fully present at Buddhahood are naturally present within us now. The limitless primordial wisdoms in the Mahayana sutras, as in the Tantras, it describes a Buddha possessing 5 primordial wisdoms, such as the mirror-like wisdom and so on. And again, one might think they are brought about by the practice of the path, so that through the path, for instance, we transform the different aspects of consciousness, the 8 consciousnesses, into the 5 primordial wisdoms, as is explained in the Namshayeshi, the discriminating consciousness and primordial wisdom. But from the Shentong point of view, they're actually already present in the minds of all sentient beings, because the mind of all sentient beings is the Buddha nature. So, and so forth, Controller Thaye says, that's all, so forth. So in short, inseparable Buddha qualities, more innumerable than grains of sand in the Ganges. a very common kind of way of putting it, are present. Inseparable means they don't need to be added to the Buddha nature. They're there already. You see, what needs to be separated from a temporary point of view are the impurities. I say from a temporary point of view because they're only temporary, they don't naturally exist. But the qualities, you might think, I remove the impurities and add the qualities. But no, the qualities are naturally present. The path is not about making the Buddha nature any more Buddha nature. It doesn't need to be increased. It cannot be increased because it's unconditioned. So, even in the lowest of us, even the lowest sentient being, the person in whom the three disturbing emotions are strongly active, the Buddha nature is there and possesses all these qualities. As he says, these qualities have existed naturally since time without beginning, and therefore the Buddha nature is called not empty. Not empty. Phenomena are empty of their own intrinsic nature because they're fictional. They dependently arising manifestations without any solidity. Is the Buddha nature empty? Not of its own qualities, because those qualities are unconditioned, like the Buddha nature itself. It's empty of the impure things, they've never become part of it, so we can say Buddha nature is empty of everything apart from its own nature. So, why is it not empty in the same way as conditioned phenomena? Because it's not empty of its own qualities. So we should understand that with confidence that the basis, the Buddha nature, is free from impurity. The basis meaning that which is present and upon which samsara and nirvana both arise. In the sense that if we recognize the Buddha nature, that is nirvana. If we do not recognize it, the ignorance proliferates and samsara arises. That fact that the Buddha nature is the basis of samsara and nirvana might make one think, oh, I need to purify the Buddha nature. But that is not true. The basis has always been free from impurity and is at the same time the source of all qualities. As it says, Control Lodhitae quotes from the Supreme Continuity, the element, the dhatu in Sanskrit, kam in Tibetan, it's a synonym for Buddha nature. The element is empty of temporary stains, which are characterized by complete separateness, meaning they never became part of the Buddha nature mind. But it is not empty of its unsurpassable qualities, which are characterized by complete inseparability, meaning they've never been other than the Buddha nature itself. And this is, of course, the essence of this Shentong view. Shentong, empty of other, empty of the temporary stains, not empty of its own qualities. Again, he quotes the Jude Lama, luminous, uncreated, inseparable, pervasive and completely endowed with the qualities of the Buddha, more numerous than grains of sand in the Ganges. Now, so that is kind of emphasis. Now, again, to introduce the Buddha nature in a kind of almost like a shocking way, one might say. And again, this is based upon the Jude Lama. In the Jude Lama, chapter or Vajra point 4, again it says, it asks the question, or Maitreya asks the question, what is the result of recognizing the Buddha nature? And there, he says, it is perfect purity, perfect self, perfect permanence, perfect bliss. And one might ask, what is, okay, so didn't you promise us a shock? Well, I just delivered it. Because, of course, actually in the common Dharma, both Hinayana and Mahayana, it said there are 4 perverse or totally erroneous views which are the basis of the disturbing emotions, karma, and so on. And they are to assert that any phenomenon is pure, to assert that any phenomenon is permanent, to assert that any phenomenon possesses or is a self, or to assert that any phenomenon is blissful. Because clinging to such ideas gives rise, as I said, to the disturbing emotions and karma. So Maitreya is saying something that seems to be contradicting that fundamental set of teachings. But that is, if we understand it in that way, that's a misconception of the context in which this teaching was given. And also, it means that we will actually not recognize the Buddha nature, because we'll be, as it were, not able to move beyond the negation of conditioned phenomena. So it's again, the key to this teaching is to understand for whom the teachings were delivered. So for those who are new to the Dharma, the four, so to speak, just entering the Dharma from non-Buddhist background, whatever that may be, the Buddha had to stress the four perverse views had to be overcome by their opposites, so that impermanence of phenomena had to be taught in order that people could give up their clinging to things being truly permanent, like objects being permanent, selves being permanent, and so on. So this is how Jamgon Kongtrul explains. For disciples and solitary realizers, the Pratyeka Buddhas, there's the two types of Hinayanists and so forth, for them, they regard the teaching given by the Buddha on suffering, etc., as a remedy to clinging to happiness. One might think that there is happiness to be found in this world by possessions, by indulging one's disturbing emotions, and so on and so forth. So Buddha had to teach that all phenomena are characterized by suffering to allow his followers to overcome that clinging. Also, similarly, impermanence for them is a remedy to clinging to mistaken permanence, like entities enduring forever. The teaching on non-self for them is a remedy to clinging to the notion of self. For instance, thinking, my mind is myself, my body is myself, or my self is something that owns these phenomena. And impurity is the remedy taught by Buddha for mistakenly clinging to things being pure, meaning that they're not multiple and stained with impurity, as all conditioned phenomena actually are. So that is the teaching of counteracting the four perverse views held by non-Buddhists, which the Hinayanists must hear and meditate. But if we think these four remedy teachings are describing the ultimate nature of reality, then that is a mistake. It's a temporary, like any remedy. A medicine as a remedy must be taken to overcome a specific illness, a specific imbalance, but once the illness is overcome and balance is attained, you don't continue to take the medicine, because the medicine then will become poisonous. So similarly with these remedy teachings. So the real meaning, he says, of the words of the conqueror is like this. Non-self, when the teaching of non-self is given by the Buddha, it refers to samsaric phenomena. But with regard to the Buddha, one can say self, in the sense that the Buddha is our true nature. Therefore, when he says that in the Judlama, the result of realizing the Buddha nature is the true self, he means you discover your true identity, which is to be that you always have been no other than a Buddha. So therefore one can use that word self then, which otherwise one could not use if one was mistaking it for conditioned phenomena. Similarly, impermanence refers to is valid as a teaching for the Hinayanists, and also their states, for instance, their states of realization, the four levels of a noble one achieved by arhats and solitary realizers, they're not the final Buddhahood. So they too are impermanent. It's right to use the word impermanent for them. But for the Dharmakaya of the Buddha, the ultimate nature of a Buddha, the ultimate manifestation of Buddha nature, one could describe that as permanent. So it is true permanence, perfection of permanence. And then thirdly, suffering. Suffering is valid when it refers to the teachings and the results of the teachings, followed by non-Buddhists. But when one's talking about nirvana, so all the results that they gain, even up to and including rebirth in heavens and so on and so forth, they're still suffering. They don't go beyond suffering. So Buddha described all samsaric phenomena as all conditioned phenomena as suffering, in order that people would not mistake such samsaric experiences as the true goal. But bliss, the opposite to suffering, of course, is true of the complete nirvana achieved by Buddhas, because it is the achievement of none other than the unconditioned nature, which does not come and go and is not therefore characterized by suffering in comparison to the goals achieved by non-Buddhists. And then the fourth teaching, to say it is the perfection of purity. When we're talking about impurity, when Buddha talks about impurity, he's referring to compounded phenomena, and therefore by this encouraging the followers not to cling to compounded phenomena of body or mind as pure. But when it comes to the qualities of the Buddhas, and to one's own mind as the Buddha nature, they are complete purity. So one can describe it in that way. So ordinary impermanence, suffering, selflessness, bliss, or impurity, they're valid teachings for beginners onto the path to counteract non-Buddhist views. But after one is engaged with the practice, then one needs to hear the transcendental teachings, the parameter teachings of true permanence, true bliss, true self, and true purity. As he says, one should recall these four teachings which completely transcend erroneous views. So you see, this is very, very important in two ways. One, it's important to know when this teaching is to be given, because if one gave it to people who hadn't overcome their clinging to the gross perverse views, the perverse views as maintained by ordinary non-Buddhist followers, then one would simply make the Buddha nature teaching something similar to non-Buddhist ideas, such as a self, a soul, a God, and so on. But when we've entered into the path, developed renunciation, and have cut through by the ordinary Madhyamaka teachings, we've cut through clinging to conditioned phenomena and so on as real, then we need to hear this teaching, because otherwise we'll be stuck in negative mode. We'll be stuck negating, and therefore never be able to relax into our true nature, the Buddha nature. So the teaching has to be given at the right time. As Contra says, in regard to Buddha nature, it is purity, since his nature is pure, and the imprints have been abandoned. It is true self, because the elaborations of self and non-self, the teaching of non-self only has a meaning in reference to somebody who is clinging to the idea of there being a self. Once one has let go of that, then one doesn't need to assert non-self as if it was an ultimate truth. It is simply a remedy. It is bliss, the Buddha, he continues, it is bliss itself, since the skandhas, which are the nature of samsaric mind and their causes, are ended. It is permanence, since samsara and nirvana are realized to be the same. Samsara has never been there. Our nature has always been the Buddha nature. The nature of all phenomena is empty, unconditioned. So we've never been apart from nirvana. So it's not even that we're going from one real state, samsara, characterized by suffering, to some perfect state, in the future, nirvana, which would of course signify impermanence, a change from one thing to another. But there is no change. Buddhahood is not actually a true change, because one has always been naturally in nirvana. As he continues, this is explained in the Jude Lama. In this way, it says that, in this way, the extraordinary basis, the Buddha nature, extraordinary basis, because in comparison to the earlier consciousness, the eighth of the 8 samsaric consciousnesses, which seems to be a basis for the other 7 consciousnesses, but is just in self empty of any nature. The Buddha nature is the true basis upon which samsara and nirvana arise. This extraordinary basis, the Buddha nature, possesses the extraordinary Buddha qualities. Extraordinary because completely different from the temporary qualities generated by, for instance, virtuous actions. They're common or ordinary qualities because they come to an end, because they're dependent upon causes and conditions. But the qualities of the Buddha nature are not produced by anything. They're just naturally present. So, in this way, the extraordinary basis, the Buddha nature possesses the extraordinary Buddha qualities, which one might describe as the many qualities of liberation. And as they'll show at liberation, although they're already present. These qualities exist right now in the basis of purification, the Buddha nature. The luminous or clear light, primordial wisdom of one's own awareness. One's natural awareness is none other than the Buddha, which of course is precisely the point of the Mahamudra and Dzogchen teachings. This luminous primordial wisdom of one's own awareness is unceasing and simultaneously arising. It's always there, and it is there together with whatever thought or emotion arises. Even though thoughts arise, they are, as it said in the Dorji Chang prayer, their essence is naturally the Dhammakaya. And that is the way in which, because of the way in which Buddha nature is always present, no matter what is manifesting. Just as one might say, the ocean water is simultaneously rising with the waves. From a dualistic point of view, one thinks the waves are impure and separate and so on, but they're none other than the water of the ocean. Similar with all thoughts and emotions. There's nothing other than the Buddha nature at all times. And this is experienced, this luminous primordial wisdom of one's own awareness is experienced through hearing, thinking, and meditating. When one has purified the temporary impurities which are to be purified, the fruit of purification, the self-abiding, the naturally abiding reality will directly manifest. This is called the stainless Dhammakaya. So in short, the Buddha nature is pure even now in us, which we could say, and we could describe this as the phase of the basis, like the starting point. And then when we practice the path, it's naturally pure. The path doesn't improve it and doesn't remove anything from it. But the path is the way of experiencing the presence of the Buddha nature within us, which we do through the threefold method of hearing the teachings, reflecting on them, digesting them, and then experiencing their reality through meditation. But nothing was purified by that. Actually, the Buddha nature is pure. But when it is purified of the temporary impurities, we call that the goal. So there's purity at the beginning, purity in the middle, purity at the end, purity in the basis, purity during the path, purity at the end. Because what is the end? What is the result? It is that the naturally abiding reality will directly manifest. That which was there, like the gold in the filth, just shines forth. The gold, when the filth is removed, the gold has never changed its nature, but now it directly manifests. Whereas when it seems to be surrounded by the filth, it's not directly manifesting. This is all. So no change in the base, no change in the Buddha nature, but simply the procedure of the path to remove everything that obscures it. And we call the Buddha nature at that point of the goal, we call that the stainless Dhammakaya. But it's nothing new, nothing different than the Buddha nature. The Buddha nature is the Dhammakaya in the phase of the basis. In the phase of the goal, the Buddha nature is called Dhammakaya. So therefore, how should we understand the teachings of the notion of samsara and nirvana? Because one thinks in this way, there is a problem, which is samsara. I'm stuck in samsara, all sentient beings are stuck in samsara. Somehow we have to get free from samsara. That's how we engage in the path initially, with this kind of framework, with this kind of concept. But actually, from the point of view of the Buddha nature teachings, this concept has to be discarded. It has to be let go of. Because as Jamgon Kongtrul says, the whole of samsara and nirvana, as they arise, never move from this basis. Why is that? Because what actually happened? What did samsara do? It didn't do anything to the basis. Because samsara, the totality of the 6 realms, and the causes that underline those 6 realms, karma and disturbed emotions, based on attachment to self, all of those are utterly devoid or empty of any intrinsic nature. So the base never changed. And the idea that nirvana is like the alternative, somewhere else that has to be obtained by replacing samsara, that also is utterly mistaken. As Kongtrul Lodro Thai says, like a reflection in a flawless crystal which appears in various manifestations. But although the reflections appear, they do not become part of the crystal. So it is with the Buddha nature, the primordial reality, the pure mind itself. The appearances of samsara arise, the appearances of nirvana arise when we enter into the path. But did anything happen to the crystal? No. These reflections, which are not part of the crystal, which never became part of the crystal, simply happened due to temporary causes and conditions, but they never stained the crystal itself. They did not become part of it. And this is how we understand the inseparability of samsara and nirvana, which is referred to, of course, in the Dorji Chang prayer, which we recite every afternoon this week. That is the meaning of it. When natural, as Kongtrul Lodro Thai says, when natural awareness, luminous and empty, is nakedly exposed, is when you're able to be introduced to the purity of your mind, your natural awareness, which is the clear light, but at the same time empty, without any restriction, limitless, because it has no point of arising, no point of enduring, no point of cessation. When you're introduced to this, when it's, as it were, laid bare nakedly by the pointing out instruction of the Lama, then whatever appearances of samsara, nirvana, and the path, which seems to be from samsara to nirvana, whatever appearances arise, they're always self-arising and self-liberated, and the nature is never stained. It means that something that is self-arising and self-liberated is like the way a ripple arises on a stream. The ripple arises, one may think, oh, what to do to get rid of the ripple and return to the purity of the stream, the natural unmovingness of the stream, the unruffledness of the stream. Nothing. The wave or the ripple arises and subsides without any artificial engagement, without anything needing to be done. So it self-arises and simultaneously self-liberates. So it is, when one has been introduced to the Buddha nature mind, the primordial purity, one can understand that the totality of samsaric appearances and the appearances of the path and the notion of nirvana are without any reality whatsoever. Hence this strong stress in Mahamudra and Dzogchen in self-arising, self-liberating. How one should, in others, regard all thoughts or emotions that arise, because they're naturally empty and the Buddha nature does not need to be added to or improved by any technique. With this view, it says, Controller says, there are no defiled imprints to remove, and there is no need to add any new special qualities that did not exist before. Again, extremely radical teaching, because at the beginning of the path, when we first engage with the Dharma, we actually do think there are defilements, obscurations, karmic imprints to be removed, because after all we think they're the cause of my suffering and the cause of the suffering of all beings. So we engage with developing the notion of renunciation, the notion that these impure elements must be overcome. And we practice remedy practices to do that. But actually, they never really arose. They were never really there in the first place. They're just like the reflections arising in dependence upon the crystal. And if one does not realize that, then in fact one will never be able to overcome them. That is a paradox. Because if one believes in the reality of that which is to be removed, no matter what one piles up to overcome it, one will be stuck in a dualistic framework, thinking there is enemy, defilement, thought, whatever it is, and I must find some way of overcoming it. So you give a reality to that which is to be overcome, so to speak. You give a false solidity to that. And then you're stuck in this way of practicing, which is always, I have a problem to overcome. And if I just put more effort into it, squeeze one more effort out of myself, I will overcome this enemy. But the enemy returns again, stronger, by your efforts to kill him, to overcome him. So, for, as it were, success, if that word means anything, for success on the path, one needs to let go, finally, of the idea there is anything to be overcome. And at the same time, there is no need to add any new special qualities that did not exist before, because they're already there. And besides which, if you thought that you could make qualities of the Buddha nature, if you just did the right things, you did this, you did the other, you followed the instruction kit, the instruction pack, how to build yourself a Buddha, your Buddha would be a conditioned entity and would fall apart. No matter how skillful a craftsman you are with the techniques of the Dharma, your Buddha is useless. He's not a Buddha, she's not a Buddha at all, but just another samsaric delusion. So therefore it is vital to hear this teaching. There is no faults to overcome and no qualities to be produced. Having made, Controller Thaye says, having made the main practice, the noble primordial wisdom, resting in emptiness, practice for whatever lengths of session are possible. So, in other words, the meditation instruction is, if you have this confidence, because you've been introduced to the teaching, then, in a way, just rest, just relax, just let go. Again, as the same kind of approach as it's taken in Mahamudra, uncontrived naturalness. Don't add anything. Don't try to improve anything. Don't remove anything. Just let go. Just relax. As Karmapa Michio says in his text on Shentong, it's just the Buddha nature settling in the Buddha nature. That is the supreme meditation. That's it. No technique. Consider the following Vajra words. Again, they're from the Jude Lama. Contra says, nothing to remove, nothing whatsoever to add. Seeing this as it is, when it's seen, there is perfect liberation. One could take that as, in a way, the the guide to the whole practice of this teaching. Nothing to remove. How can there be? How can you don't need to remove clouds. They're naturally empty. Nothing whatsoever to add. The sky is naturally perfect, naturally clear, naturally open. You cannot make the sky more sky. Nothing to add to the sky. When you see that, when you see through the clouds and see the natural purity of the sky, that's liberation. You're free from all your delusions. The Buddha nature is naturally manifesting. So he says you can recite or contemplate on that verse. And on this point, Jetsun Taranata, the great great Jonampa master, said, who actually Jamgon Cultural Odutai considered one of his previous incarnations. Jetsun Taranata says, if one brings together meditation on the Buddha nature and reflection on the qualities of the extraordinary qualities of the Buddha, if one does that with mind free from distinction, it is a supreme path of the Buddha's direct meaning. And again, having rested in meditation upon this, Jamgon Kontra says, one can remember the words in the Jude Lama, the unchanging nature of reality is the same before as after. This is again a very famous line from the Jude Lama. The same before as after, meaning the Buddha nature, which is called here the unchanging nature of reality, is it different in a Buddha than it is in us, samsaric beings? He's the after, we're the before. But did the Buddha nature change? Not in the slightest. The Buddha nature didn't become more perfect, and because it cannot be made more perfect. Simply, the Buddha recognizes, sees the nature of his or her mind, and does not believe any longer in the obscurations. The obscurations have disappeared because they were never there in the first place. We, however, have not seen through the obscurations. We cling to them as real, and therefore we feel are not a Buddha. But our Buddha nature element is unconcerned, unstained by that. It is the same now as it will be in Buddhahood. And if that weren't the case, the practice of the path would be useless. You see, one might say, oh, to hear this teaching might make people lazy because they think, oh, I'm already a Buddha, so I don't need to do anything. Well, that's true. In a way, you don't need to do anything. But your Buddha nature is not radiating for other sentient beings because you, despite pretending you are Buddha, actually do not really believe you are. You really believe you're a self. And you really do believe that objects exist. And therefore you really experience, or seem to experience, disturbing emotions and karma. It's all the fiction, of course, but you're still asleep. You're still dreaming. So you need to wake up. That is the point. So part of waking up is being inspired. We're being told what you're dreaming about is unreal. There's natural perfection already present. That will cause us to wake up. That is the point of the path. So even though we're already Buddha, we must, in our temporary deluded state, engage with the path. As Control Odutai says, to point out exactly how we understand enlightenment in this Shentong system, the naturally luminous Buddha nature has existed in one since beginningless time. Thus, in this system, when through being introduced to the perfect view and meditation on that, one sees one's face directly and the impurities have vanished. That is what we call perfect enlightenment. So that is what we mean by becoming enlightened. Seeing your face. Your face has been there at all times, but you've not been able to be introduced to it. Now in this teaching, you're introduced to your natural face. And when you are, everything you imagined about your nature, everything you experienced as a result of those imaginations, false imaginations about who you are, I'm such a person, I'm that person, I'm this body, I'm these thoughts, all that entirely disappears. But your face doesn't change. It's like you've just now finally found your natural face. And that is what we mean by coming to Buddhahood in our system. Not going to somewhere else, not traveling to some high place, even talk about the paths and bhumis and so on. Even these are skillful means to generate enthusiasm in us. But if we think that means that we have to go from one truly existent state, deluded sentient being, to another truly existent separate state, Buddhahood, then we'll never actually arrive at Buddhahood, because it will be always, so to speak, separate from us. Something which we have to get to by conditioned effort. So that cannot be enlightenment. That view that enlightenment is outside of us, a different state from us, an alien nature and so on, that's not it. It is rather just being introduced to your own nature, your own face, as it's put here, your natural face. And of course, that is exactly how it's also understood in the Tantras, and in particular Mahamudra and Dzogchen. This is what we designate as fruit, being introduced to your natural face and resting in it. Faith and certainty arise towards it as a cause and as a path by hearing this teaching. Cause meaning the Buddha nature, and the path, the purification of that which surrounds your Buddha nature. And again, he quotes him the Jud Lama about this, about how we understand enlightenment. That which is termed natural luminosity can be compared to the sun or the sky. Again, here, natural luminosity is yet another synonym for the Buddha nature, which is the natural state of your mind. It can be compared to the sun or to the sky. It becomes temporarily obscured by the dense clouds of the obscurations of the disturbing emotions and the obscuration of cognizables, knowables, meaning the dualistic misperception of reality. These are the two main obscurations which we describe. They are like the clouds in this analogy. The natural luminosity, the clear light nature of mind, can be compared to the sun surrounded by the clouds or the sky surrounded by the clouds. He continues, the Jud Lama continues, but Buddhahood, endowed with all stainless Buddha qualities, is permanent, stable, and eternal. The clouds, formed by the disturbing emotions and ignorance about reality, they come and go. They're impermanent, and therefore do not become part of the sun or do not become part of the sky, and do not permanently distort or alter or stain its nature. But Buddhahood, the nature of the sky or the sun, it's symbolized by the sun or the sky in this analogy, is permanent, stable, and eternal. The sky was there before the clouds, while the clouds are there, and will be there afterwards. I should clarify that. Of course, from our point of view, conventional truth point of view, we would say the clouds have always been obscuring the Buddha nature, because one cannot find a first point to ignorance. That's why in Nimpotempa, Karmapa Ranjador says, beginningless, but they have an end. So the clouds have been obscuring the sun and the sky, they from beginningless time, but when one recognizes the sun and the sky for what they are, the clouds have gone, so they will not last forever. Whereas Buddhahood will. Buddhahood is permanent, stable, and eternal. It is achieved in reliance, and this Buddhahood is achieved in reliance upon the pure discriminating and primordial wisdoms. What does he mean? Pure discriminating means the wisdom, it's called in Sanskrit prajna, of the sixth perfection. And the object that's realized by that is emptiness of all conditioned phenomena. So with that aspect of wisdom, through analysis, you realize that the clouds, the skandhas, the disturbing emotions, whatever it is, are unreal. But then the transcendental or primordial wisdom, the jnana, 10th perfection in fact, that arises because it's non-dual, and it is just the sun recognizing it is the sun, just the sky realizing its own sky-like nature. Or, as I described it earlier, Buddha nature recognizing itself, which is not a dualistic frame, which is because one is not separate from the Buddha nature. So it's beyond concept. So the two wisdoms are what allow you to recognize the Buddha nature and therefore manifest the Buddhahood. As he says, as Control says, undivided by beginning and end, by center and periphery, not two, free from the three, stainless, non-discriminating, the Dharmakaya nature which permanently abides, which was never produced by anything, which never alters and will never cease, is seen by the yogin who rests in equanimity. And that again shows that in a way to fully realize the Buddha nature teaching, one must go beyond mere analysis. The mere analysis leads you to understand no more than the emptiness of conditioned phenomena, the clouds, that they're fiction. But one must go beyond that to this non-conceptual wisdom that can only arise through meditation, through giving up the dualistic framework of even being a meditator, meditating on anything whatsoever, even the Buddha nature itself. As long as one sees it in that way, one can never actually recognize the Buddha nature, because it's always something distinct from oneself as the practitioner. So finally you have to go beyond that. So it shows that this teaching, as I said at the beginning, is in a way beyond reason, not irrational, not fantasy, but one has to go beyond reason to finally realize its meaning. And that means meditation. As he says, when one has developed certainty in this, then you conclude your session of meditation. So that take you 30 minutes then, every day? No. It'll take as long as it takes. But happily enough, I see there's 1 minute left of this session. So let's follow Jamgon Kongtrul's advice really and sit for a couple of minutes. And then tomorrow we have to go to the next part of the structure, of Jamgon Kongtrul's structure, the teaching on how do we bring this meditation on the view of Buddha nature, how do we bring it into everyday life and strengthen our confidence in it. So that is where we will go tomorrow, but now let's just sit for a couple of minutes. Baldan sare lama rinpoche dagye chiwo pemme densha kadin tembo go ne jezande kusun tu che na dra sando sa. Sunandi Damshi Sebane Tobene Ben Ranam Pamchene Chiga Nachibal Sepe Sole Roa Roa. Okay, so we'll continue tomorrow then.